And thanks for watching Morning Live. Now, the South African Teachers Union, SADTU, has released its call for security to be beefed up at schools. Now, it in fact wants a summit on the matter, and this to discuss violence in our schools. And SADTU was reacting to an attack at Forest High School, story we've been carrying in the news as well, where a grade 8 pupil who was stabbed and killed on Monday was killed by a fellow learner, a 19-year-old grade 11 pupil, and this of course alleged to be a part of ongoing gang violence in our schools. So to speak to us more about this matter, I'm joined by Xolani Fakude, who's SADTU's Secretariat Officer. Thanks so much for coming through.
Thank you. Let me greet you and let me greet the viewers as well.
So obviously not a pleasant time to be talking about, what is going on in our schools, and there are many things going on. But let's start by focusing on the issue of security in schools. SADTU's position on that?
Well, look, what we're calling for is that our workplace as educators, as support personnel in schools, is increasingly becoming unsafe. In fact, we always say that being an educator these days, or working within a school environment, is almost becoming like a dangerous profession. And we're saying that that is not sustainable. If we are to reach the goals that we have set ourselves as a country, in as far as the NDP is concerned, for instance, that is just not possible. So we're saying that we need to feel safe in our schools. There needs to be increased security measures in our schools. But over and above everything else, what matters to us is that the conversation needs to be localized. You said in your intro that SADTU is also calling for a summit to discuss this particular issue of school violence. But further than that, what we're saying is that we want localized summits. For us, that is what matters. Because we did have no less than 2 summits last year. For instance, one called by the Department of Basic Education, another one called by the Education Labour Relations Council. But now what we're saying is that the conversation must happen where it matters the most. And what matters the most is actually at a community level, the most localized level, because that is where the violence takes place. Remember that the school is a microcosm of society. What happens in the school is exactly a reflection of the immediate communities. So until we get to a point as society whereby we're all mobilized towards defending and protecting education, protecting educators and learners, that is only the time when we are going to advance society. That is why SADTU has actually launched a campaign called the #I am a school fan campaign. This is where we're mobilizing all of society to say that the same love that you would have for your soccer team, for instance, we're a soccer crazy country. We're saying offer the same love to your local school. Take ownership of the education of your children, because that reflects the future of the country.
So it's not the first time that SADTU have called for tighter security in schools. What has changed over the years? If we take a look at the last 5 years, for example, how have things changed?
Look, we have not necessarily seen any significant change since we have been making these calls. This is quite a very historic call that SADTU has been making. But now you would know that we've got what we call the National School Safety Framework. Now it is there. Now if it was to be implemented in line with what it is said to achieve as objectives in schools, for instance, then maybe we may start making progress. However, the implementability part of it becomes the issue. And when you look at the implementability part of it, that is where we then need to have a multi-stakeholder conversation. We are saying, when you look, for instance, at the NSSF, the National School Safety Framework, it speaks of annual safety audits in schools. It speaks of functional safety committees. It speaks of incidents reporting systems, early warning systems, and so forth, including even psychosocial services. But now, until we get to a point whereby every stakeholder that is involved within the value chain takes their particular role, take their responsibility, only then we'll make progress.
So why aren't those stakeholders taking their responsibility seriously?
Well, perhaps the conversation is not taking place at all the levels where it should be taking place. Like I said, last year we had no less than 2 to 3 major summits, in actual fact, discussing school violence. But now we are saying that the conversation must move further from that. We have agreed. We all know what the problems are, the lack of psychosocial services, etc. But now what we are saying is that, are we in actual fact engaging the local communities, the street committees, where it matters the most? And that is what SADTU is saying right now.
So the difficulty, as you point out, is that there needs to be greater ownership by parents, by broader community structures.
Yes.
And that is not happening. But what are some of the reasons you believe for people not taking ownership of the schools?
Well, we think that some of the reasons is that we are not necessarily sustaining the discussion as a country. It is almost as if we wait to see something in social media, we wait for an incident to be in one of those platforms, and then there is a whole outcry. But then you would appreciate the fact that the incidents that you would probably see in public through social media, that is just the tip of the iceberg. What we are saying is that this is now a national crisis. We have reached that particular level. And what matters for us as SADTU, that is why we're saying that we want to sustain a campaign called the I Am a School Fan campaign, is that we must also sustain the conversation. Let it be in the psyche of the society that we need to own education. But what matters for us as well is parental involvement. What all successful education systems exhibit as a common denominator is increased parental involvement. And we have seen, we've got our members reporting to us, for instance, that a parents' meeting will be convened in the school, and there'll be more teachers and support personnel in that meeting more than parents. So but that again, tells you that there is a crisis, and we need to talk about it.
Again, it's a historical problem. It's not something that is new. But you spoke earlier about localizing some of these problems. Is this not something that, as a SADTU and as other stakeholders within our schooling sector, you ought to localize, where perhaps the school, the teachers, the governing body, the personnel needs to go out and actually get the members of society to understand why it's important for them to actually take ownership of the school?
But that is precisely what we are doing. That is exactly what we are doing.
How are you doing
hence we're speaking about localized summits. But now what is important for us is that, you see, the matter of school safety, violence in schools, it cannot just be limited. It cannot be an initiative to ameliorate of only those who are involved within the immediate schooling system. This discussion, this conversation must actually be society-driven. And that is why we are now saying that let the summits that we are calling for be as localized as possible. So let us do it the other way around. Do not wait. As a community, do not wait for the SGP, for instance, to come and say that we've got a problem of gangs around this particular school. Do something as a society yourself. But then now, let me also make this example. It has become normal in this country during community service protests, for instance, to use schools as the first bargaining chip when we want to demand services. We had the example of Vuani, we had an example in Mpumalanga at some point. Now, that tells you that there is something wrong with our communities. It cannot be correct that when you want to have water, you think that closing down the school classrooms will therefore assist in doing that. So that is why we're saying that the conversation needs to be broadened. It needs to involve all the stakeholders. It needs to happen where it matters the most. But then it needs to be society. It needs to be community-driven, because education, after all, is a societal matter.
You are 100% correct. But also, your own members have also used, school time to go and attend SADTU meetings. They have used school premises to hold those meetings, sending children home. They are also guilty of holding society to ransom and holding our children's future to ransom in some instances.
Well, one would probably say that is not necessarily an accurate reflection, because remember that how we have union meetings, that is governed by the Labour Relations Act. So that is there. But then now
during
primarily,
school time.
But no, well, that is not scientific at all. What we have always said.
Are you telling me that has not happened, Mr. Fakude?
Look, there will always be incidences. There will always be those isolated incidences that will happen. Well, if it does happen, what I'm saying is that primarily in schools, there are school management teams. When I go into my employment as a teacher, my employer is in this case the Department of Basic Education. And I'm saying that there is a contract that I have signed as a teacher with the employer, and therefore how I behave, the intransitions that might happen during the time when I should be in class. Therefore, that is when then we need to see stronger school management teams coming into the place. But what I am saying, therefore, is that it cannot be scientific. We are not necessarily out of a class.
The point I'm simply making is that you also need to take accountability for your members to the point that you were making about communities holding children to ransom. And I conceded that you were absolutely correct. But you also need to take accountability and responsibility for when your members do exactly the same.
Well, in actual fact, I can even tell you right now that as early as around June last year, we were out in public, we were speaking to our members, we always send those communiques, and we always say that if we're going to have union meetings, we need to do them such that we do not necessarily disrupt class time. And should that be the case, therefore there will be arrangements that are going to be made. We are the first ones to actually speak to our members and say that desist from some of the conduct, for instance, that might give an impression that we are comfortable within an environment that we see as being regressive.
And that's a fair
we take
point.
responsibilities, and that is why we always encourage and speak to our members to behave in the most professional of manners.
That's all I'm saying, and I'm glad you finally acknowledge that some of your members do engage in that type of conduct. But then moving on, you say that teachers are not security guards, and you feel it is unfair that they need to assume this type of responsibility within the schooling environment. Talk to us about your immediate concerns and if you can perhaps give us some examples of how teachers have really had to step into that role.
Well, I mean, educators are overburdened already as it is. We always speak of the administrative burden that an educator would face. We are still a system, by the way, that is still dependent, you would know, to sort of consolidate what we'll be doing during normal contact time, on afternoon classes, on morning classes, on weekend classes, on holiday classes, and the list goes on. So what we are saying, therefore, is that we are going to do what we need to do on our part as educators and as a union in particular. But now, at the same time, we are already overburdened from what is expected of us, and we're saying we need assistance. That is why we're calling, one of our most emphatic calls, by the way, is for psychosocial services. It is completely unfair to expect an educator who faces, by the way, already, who is in a classroom that is beyond the normal or rather the expected learner-teacher ratio, and you expect them to carry out all the other responsibilities towards educating a child. So we're therefore saying that cannot just be left to the teacher.
Please break it down, because I'm sure there are parents who are listening who don't understand what you mean by that. Let's talk about what you mean by psychosocial services, and also with regard to some of the additional roles that parents need to also be aware of. What are you talking about?
Our primary responsibility is to be in class, in time, and to teach. Right? And then, of course, there will be some administrative tasks attached to that. We're saying we're overburdened by that. Now, when it comes to psychosocial services, we talk of early warning systems. Now, if a learner is going to, at some point, behave violently in a classroom, we are saying that as educators, it is not our primary responsibilities. We are not trained to even pick up those. What should be happening is that then bring in the psychosocial services elements of it, be it social workers from the local clinic or whatever the case may be, to come in and do regular assessment, regular interaction with learners, so that we can then be in a position when the teacher says, I am concerned with a particular learner, we can then have the relevant service, in this case being social services, for instance, taking over that case, even if there is an instance whereby they need to then take it further and interact with the parents of that particular learner, then so be it. But we're saying that cannot be left solely to the teacher. It is completely unfair.
All right, I'll tell you what, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and speak to Xolani Fakude with regard to some of their expectations, what they are hoping would change and what would be listened to for things to get better in our schools. Right after this.